The bone was the color of bleached driftwood against the boy's muddy skin. It had punched clean through the flesh of his forearm, a jagged, unnatural angle in a world that had lost all its right angles. His name was Leo. He was 7, and he was staring at it with a detached curiosity that was far more terrifying than tears. Tears would have been normal. This silent shock was a prelude to a crash Alara Vance knew she had to prevent. "Hey, Leo," she said, her voice a low, steady hum against the symphony of chaos in the St. Jude's School gymnasium. "You know what that looks like? A periscope, like on a submarine." The boy's wide, dark eyes flickered up to hers. Rain hammered a frantic, syncopated rhythm on the steel roof above, and the groan of stressed metal was a constant companion. The air, thick with the smell of wet wool, antiseptic and fear, was lit by the jittery beams of a dozen headlamps and flashlights. Hurricane Iris had turned Port Mercy into an archipelago of ruins, and this gym was their ark. "A submarine?" Leo whispered, his voice hoarse. "Yep, it's just peeking out to see what's going on," Ellie continued, her hands moving with a practiced, gentle efficiency. She was 26, but in moments like this, she felt ageless. There was only the patient, the problem, and the solution. She'd already cleaned the wound with the last of her sterile water, her mind a running inventory of dwindling supplies. "We just need to tell it to go back down below, no big deal." It was, of course, a very big deal. A compound fracture in these conditions was a VIP invitation for every opportunistic bacteria on the Gulf Coast. She had no anesthesia, no antibiotics to speak of, and what passed for a splint was 2 paint stirrers and a roll of duct tape she'd scavenged from the janitor's closet. She worked quickly, murmuring nonsense about pirates and sea monsters, her focus so absolute that the 70-odd other souls huddled in the gym faded into a muted backdrop of coughs and cries. She felt the sickening grate as she guided the bone back into alignment. The boy whimpered, a tear finally tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "Good," Ellie breathed, wrapping the arm with a swiftness that belied the tremor of adrenaline in her hands. "The periscope is down. Submarine is diving." She looked up, her headlamp beam cutting a swath through the gloom, and saw Leo's mother watching, her face a mask of gratitude and terror. Ellie gave her a small, tired nod. It was the best she could do. It had to be enough. For 36 hours, it had been like this. Ellie, the only registered nurse who hadn't evacuated, had become the de facto medical authority. She'd set a dislocated shoulder, stitched a nasty gash on a firefighter's leg, and dispensed non-existent comfort with the last of the school's first aid supplies. She was running on fumes and a stubborn refusal to quit. That's when the new light appeared. Not the flicker of a flashlight, but the blinding, sterile white of high-intensity searchlights. They sliced through the boarded-up windows, sweeping across the huddled masses and making everyone flinch. The roar of heavy engines followed, rumbling through the floor. A wave of relief washed through the gym. "It's FEMA," someone choked out. "They're here." The main doors groaned open, forced against a frame swollen with damp. 2 figures stood silhouetted against the storm's gray twilight, their uniforms crisp, their posture rigid. They looked like visitors from another planet. The man in the lead strode in, his boots splashing in the puddles on the linoleum. He was in his 50s, with silvering temples and a face that looked like it had been carved from disappointment. A badge on his pristine jacket read, "Dr. Alistair Finch, FDRMT Commander." His eyes, cold and analytical, scanned the gymnasium not as a shelter for the suffering, but as a problem to be assessed. He didn't see people. He saw logistical hurdles. His gaze swept past the crying children and the elderly shivering under thin blankets, landing on Ellie and her makeshift clinic. He walked over, his expression souring with every step. "What is this?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the din with chilling precision. It was not a question of inquiry, it was an accusation. Ellie, still kneeling by Leo's side, looked up. "This is a triage center, or the closest thing I could manage." Dr. Finch's lip curled in a faint sneer. He nudged a pile of bloody gauze with the toe of his immaculate boot. "This is an unsanitary, unauthorized, and frankly, dangerous assembly. We have protocols for a reason, miss. They exist to prevent well-meaning but misguided individuals from making a bad situation worse." Ellie felt a hot spike of anger pierce through her exhaustion. She had held this place together with little more than gauze and sheer will, and this man's first act was to condemn it. She rose slowly to her feet, her back aching in protest. "My name is Alara Vance. I'm an RN. And for the past 2 days, my misguided efforts were the only thing standing between these people and something much worse." Finch barely acknowledged her words. His attention was already elsewhere, directing his team with sharp, clipped commands. Designate quadrants. Set up proper intake. I want this area sterilized and cleared within the hour. The real work can begin now. He turned back to Ellie, his eyes dismissing her entirely. You can report to the volunteer intake desk once it's established. We'll see if we can find something for you to do, perhaps handing out water. The cavalry had arrived, and Ellie realized with a sinking heart that they weren't here to fight the disaster. They were here to fight the chaos, and in their cold, orderly world, she was just another piece of it that needed to be managed. The storm outside was ending, but a new one, she suspected, was just beginning. Within 12 hours, the St. Jude's gymnasium was unrecognizable. The warm, desperate chaos Ellie had managed was replaced by a cold, humming efficiency. The FDRMT moved with the precision of an occupying army. Portable generators hummed, casting a flat, unforgiving fluorescent glare over everything. The floor was mopped with bleach, the air now sharp with its sterile scent. Green, yellow, and red tarps were laid out on the floor, creating a brutally clear hierarchy of suffering. The huddled masses were now orderly lines of supplicants, clutching pieces of paper. The Ark had become a processing center. Dr. Finch presided over it all from a folding table laden with laptops and binders, a king on a throne of bureaucracy. His word was law, and his law was the protocol. The protocol dictated everything: the number of bandages per patient, the caloric content of the meal packs, the precise criteria for admission and discharge. It was a system designed to be flawlessly defensible on paper and utterly soul-crushing in practice. Ellie, relegated to taking vital signs at an intake table, watched the system grind people down. A frantic mother whose son had a 103-degree fever was given Tylenol and a form to fill out. An elderly man, gasping with the early signs of pneumonia, was designated yellow tag to be observed because his oxygen saturation was still technically above 92%. Humanity was a variable, the clipboard was a constant. The personification of this new order was Nurse Ratcliffe, a senior FDRMT nurse with a perpetually pursed mouth and tired, resentful eyes. She saw Ellie not as a colleague, but as an indictment of her own weary compliance. Ratcliffe was a creature of the system. She documented everything, followed every directive to the letter, and seemed to take a grim satisfaction in the power it afforded her. "Vance," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut tape. "Dr. Finch wants the intake forms triple-checked. Last batch had 2 signatures on the wrong line." She glanced at Ellie's station. "And that blanket? Is that standard issue?" Ellie looked at the shivering old man she'd just handed a wool blanket to, one she'd found in the school's Lost and Found. He was cold. "Huh. Everything is logged, everything is accounted for," Ratcliffe snapped. "We are not a charity. We are a federal response unit. Use the issued Mylar sheets." She made a note on her own clipboard before gliding away, a shark in the sterile waters. It was in this suffocating environment that Ellie began to truly connect with the ones the system was failing. First was Mr. Henderson. He was 84, with the translucent, papery skin of the very old and eyes that seemed lost in a fog of memory. He had type 2 diabetes and a hacking cough that was getting worse. His chart, which Ellie reviewed in a stolen moment, noted mild respiratory distress, but Ellie heard the telltale rattle of fluid in his lungs. Finch's plan was to stabilize his blood sugar and discharge him. "Where is your family, Mr. Henderson?" Ellie asked, her voice gentle as she checked his pulse. He didn't seem to hear. He was fumbling with a worn leather wallet, pulling out a faded, dog-eared photograph of a smiling woman. "That's my Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with phlegm. "She made the best pecan pie. The secret was a little bit of bourbon." He coughed, a deep, wet sound that made Ellie wince. "He needs a chest x-ray and a course of azithromycin," Ellie told Finch later, catching him between conference calls. "I think it's pneumonia." Finch didn't look up from his screen. His O2 sats are at 93%. The protocol for suspected pneumonia in a mass casualty setting requires saturations below 92% or a respiratory rate above 30 to justify allocation of a portable x-ray unit. He is stable. We need the resources for critical patients. "Oh? He won't be stable for long," Ellie insisted, her frustration mounting. "We can prevent him from becoming critical. Isn't that the point?" "The point, Nurse Vance," Finch said, finally looking up at her with undisguised contempt, "is triage. It is the efficient allocation of limited resources to do the most good for the most people. It is not about indulging the emotional hunches of a junior nurse. Is that clear? It was perfectly clear. Finch wasn't practicing medicine. He was managing risk. Mr. Henderson was a statistic, an acceptable loss if it came to it. Then there were the Garcias. A young mother, Maria, with her 2 children, 9-year-old Carlos and 7-year-old Maya. They had lost everything in the flood. Maya had severe asthma, and the stress and damp air had her in a constant state of near crisis. Her little body shuddered with every breath. The FDRMT team had given her a rescue inhaler and tagged her green, but her mother was frantic. "They say we have to go to the big shelter at the high school," Maria told Ellie, her eyes wide with panic. "It's so crowded. What if she has an attack? This inhaler, it's almost empty." Ellie saw the terror in the mother's eyes, the strained look on Maya's face. The protocol had provided the approved treatment. The protocol was satisfied, but a child was suffering. That night, Ellie slipped them her own personal emergency inhaler she kept in her car, a clear violation of the rules. She also brought them a bag of food she'd sweet-talked a National Guardsman out of another violation. Nurse Ratcliffe saw the exchange. She didn't say a word to Ellie, but a half-hour later, Ellie was summoned to Finch's command post. "It has come to my attention, Nurse Vance, that you are distributing unauthorized medical and material supplies," Finch began, his voice dangerously calm. "You are not only violating multiple federal regulations, but you are creating a dangerous precedent. If you give to one, everyone will expect something. You are fostering dependency and undermining the system we have put in place." "I was helping a sick child," Ellie shot back, her voice trembling with rage. "You were playing God," Finch countered. "This is your final warning. Another infraction. Any deviation from protocol, and I will have you formally removed from this facility, and I will file a report with the state nursing board that will jeopardize your licensure. Do you understand me?" Ellie stood there, her hands clenched into fists. She looked past Finch, at the sea of faces in the gym. They were tired, scared, and being processed by a system that saw them as numbers on a form. And she understood perfectly. The war wasn't against the hurricane anymore. It was against him. It was a war of clipboards and protocols versus flesh, blood, and a little girl who couldn't breathe. And it was a war she had no intention of losing. She spent the rest of her shift watching Mr. Henderson. She sat by his cot long after her official hours were over, listening to the sound of his breathing, the wet crackle growing louder with each passing hour. He was no longer stable. He was deteriorating, exactly as she'd predicted. She administered a breathing treatment using a nebulizer she'd hidden from the official inventory. It was a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration of her own protocol. You don't leave a man to drown in his own lungs just because his paperwork says he's fine. When Nurse Ratcliffe walked by on her final rounds, she saw Ellie sitting by the old man's cot, holding his hand. She saw the nebulizer. She paused, her pen hovering over her clipboard. For a fleeting second, Ellie thought she saw a flicker of something else in the older nurse's eyes, doubt, maybe even a ghost of the reason she'd become a nurse in the first place. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Ratcliffe made a sharp, deliberate checkmark on her form and walked away without a word. The report had been filed. The battle lines were drawn. The end came as abruptly as the beginning. 4 days after the FDRMT's arrival, a memo was posted. The critical phase of the disaster was officially over. The media had packed their vans and moved on to the next story. Port Mercy was now in the recovery phase, a bureaucratic term that meant the emergency was no longer interesting. The street, Jude's Field Hospital, was to be dismantled within 24 hours. A wave of confusion and panic rippled through the remaining evacuees. The order was delivered by Dr. Finch with the impersonal cheer of a pre-recorded announcement. All remaining patients will be processed for discharge or transport to the Regional Medical Center in Beaumont. Transportation will be provided for all red tag patients. All other personnel are advised to seek assistance from the civilian authorities at the county-run shelter. The translation was simple. If you weren't on death's door, you were on your own. Ellie's blood ran cold. She immediately sought out the charts for her unofficial wards. The Garcia family's file had a large red "discarged" stamp across it. Mr. Henderson's was the same. Their conditions had been deemed non-critical and self-manageable. She found Finch overseeing the packing of medical supplies, directing his team with the zeal of a man ahead of schedule. "You can't discharge them," Ellie said, her voice low and tight. "Mr. Henderson has full-blown pneumonia. He's on and off oxygen. Maya Garcia is still struggling to breathe. Where are they supposed to go?" Finch sighed. the sound of a patient man dealing with a tiresome child. "Nurse Vance, their acute needs have been met according to our mandate, mister." Henderson is afebrile, and his O2 sats are holding at 92% with minimal support, which we've provided. The Garcia child has a supply of albuterol. They do not meet the stringent criteria for emergency medical transport, which is reserved for critical trauma and cardiac cases. Their situation is now a social services matter, not a federal medical one. It is out of our remit. Out of your remit? Ellie's voice rose, attracting stares. They're people, not parcels. Their homes are gone. You're discharging them to a street corner with a pamphlet. Just then, she saw it happen. 2 National Guardsmen were gently but firmly escorting Maria Garcia and her 2 children toward the gymnasium doors. Maria was pleading, trying to explain that she had no car, no family nearby, nowhere to go. The soldiers' faces were impassive. They had their orders. A few feet away, a bewildered Mr. Henderson was being helped into a wheelchair, a small plastic bag with his wallet, and the photo of his Clara on his lap. Something inside Ellie snapped. The accumulated frustration, the righteous anger, the crushing weight of the system's indifference, it all broke. She walked past Finch, her movements deliberate, and stood directly in the path of the soldiers escorting the Garcias. "Stop," she said. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it resonated with an authority that made the young soldiers pause. "They're not going anywhere." She turned to face the entire gymnasium, or what was left of it. Staffers were packing boxes. The colored tarps were being folded away. The place was being erased. "These people are still sick," she announced, her voice gaining strength. "This man has pneumonia. This child has life-threatening asthma. As a nurse, I cannot and will not clear them for discharge into an unsafe environment. They are still my patients, and this hospital isn't closed until its last patient is safe." Finch's face went from pale to crimson. "This is unbelievable," he sputtered, marching toward her. "You have no authority here, Vance. You are a civilian. You are trespassing on a federal site. I am ordering you to stand down." "No," Ellie said simply. The word hung in the air, a shocking act of rebellion. Finch was speechless for a moment. He had built his world on the assumption of compliance, on the power of the clipboard and the regulation. A simple no was a weapon he didn't know how to counter. "Fine," he hissed, recovering his composure. "You want to play the martyr? You're on your own." He turned to his team. "We are proceeding with the evacuation. Leave her. She and anyone who stays with her are no longer our responsibility. Log it." Nurse Ratcliffe, clipboard in hand, made the notation without looking at Ellie. The FDRMT staff, like a flock of birds turning in unison, went back to their packing, pointedly ignoring the small drama in the corner. As the organized retreat continued around her, Ellie went to work. She found Maria Garcia and led her and her children away from the door. She wheeled Mr. Henderson's chair away from the exit. She gathered them in a far corner of the gym, near the dusty stage that was usually used for school plays. It was a pathetic little island in an ocean of departing efficiency. She scavenged what she could: a half-used oxygen tank left behind, a box of saline solution, a handful of gauze and bandages. She created her unsanctioned ward. She found a power outlet that was still live and plugged in the nebulizer. She took Mr. Henderson's vitals and listened to Maya's lungs. She was alone, an outlaw in a place of healing. Hours passed. The gym grew cavernous and quiet as the last of the FDRMT trucks rumbled away. The generators were shut down, plunging the gym back into the gloomy, storm-lit twilight she remembered from the first day. The only sound was the hiss of the oxygen tank and Mr. Henderson's ragged breathing. That's when the new set of boots arrived. Not the polished shoes of a doctor, but the heavy, mud-caked combat boots of a soldier. Dr. Finch, true to his word, had called in the authorities to remove the trespassers. A National Guard sergeant entered, his rifle held loosely across his chest. He looked young, no older than Ellie, with a dusting of freckles and a troubled expression. His name tag read Miller. "Ma'am," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm Sergeant Miller. I'm afraid I have to ask you and these people to vacate the premises. This is a secured federal zone now." Ellie stood up, placing herself between the soldier and her patients. She was exhausted, hungry, and running on pure adrenaline, but she felt a strange calm settle over her. "I'm Nurse Vance," she replied, her voice steady, "and these are my patients. They're too sick to be moved without proper medical transport." "Ma'am, my orders are to clear the building," he said, a flicker of apology in his eyes. He was just a boy following a chain of command. Ellie didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue about regulations. She just looked him in the eye and used the only weapon she had left. "Sergeant, I want you to look at them," she said, gesturing behind her. "I want you to look at that little girl, who might stop breathing if she's forced to sleep in a damp cot in a crowded shelter. I want you to look at that old man, whose lungs are filling with fluid. Then I want you to look me in the eye and tell me your orders are more important than their lives. Are you going to throw a sick old man and a child with asthma out into the street, Sergeant? Is that the order you're going to follow today?" Sergeant Miller stood there, his gaze shifting from Ellie to the pathetic little group huddled behind her. He saw the hiss of the oxygen tank, the fear in Maria Garcia's eyes. He was a soldier, trained to obey, but he was also a human being. The cold, impersonal order he'd been given was now staring back at him with a human face. He swallowed hard, his radio crackling on his shoulder. He looked away from Ellie, unable to meet her unwavering gaze. I need to check with my CO, he mumbled, backing away a few steps. "You stay put for now." He retreated toward the door, speaking in a low voice into his radio. It wasn't a victory, not yet. It was a reprieve. A few more precious hours bought with a simple, impossible question. Ellie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, and went back to check on Mr. Henderson. The last light of day was fading outside, and she was alone, a lighthouse on a forgotten shore. The reprieve lasted until morning. The night was a long, cold vigil. Ellie dozed in a hard plastic chair, jerking awake at every cough from Mr. Henderson or whimper from a sleeping Maya. She changed his oxygen tank when the first one hissed its last, her hands fumbling in the gloom. She shared the last of her granola bars with the Garcia children. She felt the profound, bone-deep weariness of a soldier in the final hours of a siege, knowing the enemy was just regrouping beyond the hill. The enemy returned shortly after dawn, not with a sergeant, but with the commander himself. Dr. Finch strode back into the gymnasium as if reclaiming conquered territory. He wasn't alone. Flanking him was the local police officer Ellie had seen directing traffic a few days prior, a man with a tired face and a heavy-looking duty belt. "This circus ends now, Vance," Finch announced, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. He stopped a few feet from her makeshift ward, his expression a mask of cold fury. "I tried to be reasonable. I gave you a chance to walk away. Instead, you've endangered these people and flagrantly broken the law." He gestured to the police officer. "Officer Calloway is here to take you into custody for trespassing and practicing medicine without authorization on a federal site. I'm having you arrested for their own good. We will see to it they are transported to the county shelter where they belong." The officer looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting between the imperious doctor and the defiant, exhausted-looking young nurse. "Ma'am," he began, "if you'd just cooperate." Ellie rose to her feet, her body aching with protest. This was it, the end of the line. She had fought, and she had lost. She looked at Mr. Henderson, sleeping fitfully, and at Maria Garcia, clutching her children, and felt a wave of devastating failure. "Just give me a minute to explain their medical needs to whoever is taking over," she said, her voice hollow. "There is nothing to explain," Finch snapped. "Their charts are closed." It was at that precise moment of absolute despair that a new sound intruded. Faint at first, then rapidly growing louder. A rhythmic, percussive whump-whump-whump that vibrated through the floor. It wasn't a truck. It was a helicopter, and it was close. Everyone looked up towards the high windows of the gym. A dark shape passed over, momentarily blocking the gray morning light. The sound grew to a deafening roar as the aircraft settled onto the muddy football field just outside. The downdraft sent a spray of water and leaves against the windows. Finch looked irritated by the interruption. "What now?" he muttered. A few minutes later, the gymnasium doors opened again. A man entered, followed by two aides in crisp army fatigues. He was tall, in his late 60s, with a ramrod posture that spoke of a lifetime in uniform. His face was a roadmap of command, etched with lines of authority and experience. 3 silver stars gleamed on the collar of his uniform. "Dr. Finch?" the man asked, his voice a low baritone that commanded immediate attention. Finch was visibly startled, snapping to a more formal posture. "General Thorne, sir. I wasn't aware you were scheduled for an on-site visit." "I wasn't," General Marcus Thorne replied, his eyes sweeping the scene. "My pilot saw your remaining vehicle and the police cruiser. I was doing a final flyover before officially closing the Port Mercy disaster zone. Decided to see for myself why this facility was still manned. What seems to be the problem here? Finch immediately launched into his well-rehearsed narrative. No problem at all, General. Just a small civilian compliance issue we're resolving. The FDRMT mission here was a complete success. We treated over 300 patients and successfully demobilized ahead of schedule. He gestured vaguely at Ellie. This young woman has become emotionally attached and is refusing to vacate the premises. General Thorne's gaze shifted from Finch to Ellie, then to the small, pathetic huddle behind her. He saw the oxygen tank. He saw the fear on Maria Garcia's face. He saw the weary resolve in Ellie's eyes. His expression was unreadable. He ignored Finch's sputtering and walked forward, his boots making quiet, deliberate steps on the dusty floor. He didn't stop at Ellie. He walked right past her and knelt down, his decorated uniform brushing the grimy linoleum beside Mr. Henderson's cot. "Morning, soldier," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Mr. Henderson, roused by the commotion, blinked up at him. "Clara?" he mumbled. "Not Clara," the general said softly. "Just a friend. How are you feeling?" He placed a hand on the old man's shoulder, then glanced at the hissing oxygen tank and the nearly empty IV bag. He then turned his attention to Maria, offering her a small, reassuring nod. His eyes, trained to assess a battlefield in seconds, took in every detail. He rose slowly and turned to face Finch. The temperature in the gym seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "Doctor," General Thorne began, his voice dangerously quiet, "your report will state that you demobilized ahead of schedule, that you closed this facility and declared the mission a success." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I see the real success right here." He looked at Ellie. She stood there, trembling slightly, streaked with grime, her scrubs stained and rumpled. She looked like a refugee from a battle, which, he supposed, she was. "In my world, Nurse Vance," he said, his voice resonating in the silent gym, "we have a name for someone who holds the line, who reinforces the flank when everyone else has pulled back. We have a name for the one who refuses to leave their people behind." In one smooth, practiced motion, General Thorne reached up to the breast of his uniform. His fingers went to the highest ribbon, the one just above his name. With a faint click, he unpinned the Distinguished Service Medal. He took a step toward the stunned nurse. "We call them a hero." He held the heavy bronze medal in his palm for a moment before gently, reverently pinning it to the worn, faded fabric of her scrubs. It looked impossibly grand against the simple cotton. "You were the last one to leave," he said. "This belongs to you." Ellie could only stare, a single tear finally tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. The weight of the medal was real, a solid, tangible anchor in a world that had dissolved into chaos. She looked over the general's shoulder at Dr. Finch. The man's face had collapsed. The color was gone, replaced by a pasty, sickly gray. His mouth was slightly agape. In his eyes was the dawning horror of a man who had followed every rule in the book, only to find himself on the wrong side of history, judged and found wanting by a power he could not argue with. The clipboard in his hand seemed to have shrunk, becoming nothing more than a flimsy piece of pressed cardboard. His war was over, and he had been utterly and completely defeated. The aftermath was a study in quiet, decisive action. General Thorne turned from Ellie and pulled a satellite phone from his aide's pack. He made one call. "This is Thorne. I have 3 civilian medical evacuees at the St. Jude's Gymnasium in Port Mercy. Priority 1. I want a helicopter with a paramedic on board, here in 15 minutes. Yes, I'll wait." He clicked the phone off and looked at Dr. Finch, who was still standing, frozen, by the police officer. "Doctor," Thorne said, his voice now flat and cold as steel, "you will remain here. You will give my aide a full and complete accounting of your discharge protocols and the specific decisions leading to this situation. I expect your report and your resignation on my desk by Monday." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned to Officer Calloway. "Officer, thank you for your service. Your assistance is no longer required here." The officer, looking immensely relieved, gave a quick nod and practically fled the gymnasium. As the thrum of a new helicopter approached, Sergeant Miller reappeared at the door, drawn by the activity. He saw the general, the defeated Finch, and Ellie with the medal shining on her chest. He met Ellie's eyes across the gym and gave her a single, sharp nod, a gesture of profound soldier-to-soldier respect. A paramedic team bustled in, their movements efficient but infused with a new urgency. They gently prepared Mr. Henderson and the Garcias for transport, treating them not as discharged liabilities, but as VIPs. As they were being wheeled out toward the waiting helicopter, Maria Garcia stopped and threw her arms around Ellie, sobbing her thanks. Little Maya shyly handed Ellie a crayon drawing of a stick figure with a stethoscope and a shining gold star on her chest. When they were gone, and the sound of the helicopter faded, the gym fell silent. It was just Ellie and the general, standing in the morning light slanting through the high windows. "I don't know what to say," Ellie whispered, her hand instinctively going to the medal. It felt impossibly heavy. "You don't have to say anything," Thorne replied. He looked around the empty gym. "I got this medal 30 years ago, in Afghanistan. My platoon was cut off, pinned down on a ridge. We were out of ammo, out of water. The order came down to retreat, to fall back to a more defensible position. My sergeant, a young man not much older than you," he refused. He said, "We don't leave our wounded, sir." He ran back under fire to drag 2 injured men to cover. He saved them. He didn't make it back. The general looked at Ellie, his eyes conveying the weight of that memory. He didn't have a rule book, Nurse Vance. He had a duty to the people in his care. What you did here, it was the same thing. Don't ever let a man with a clipboard tell you what your duty island. He gave her a final appraising look. Get some rest, nurse. That's an order. 1 month later, the waiting room of the Port Mercy General Hospital was buzzing with the low murmur of daytime television. Ellie, back in her familiar blue scrubs, was on her break, sipping a cup of coffee that tasted like heaven. On the screen, a news anchor was discussing the fallout from Hurricane Iris. A sweeping overhaul of FEMA and FDRMT disaster response protocols has been announced today, the anchor said. The changes come following a scathing internal report filed by General Marcus Thorne, which highlighted systemic failures in patient care and a bureaucratic culture that prioritized logistics over lives. Sources say the investigation was prompted by an incident at a temporary field hospital. Ellie smiled faintly and tuned it out. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cool, heavy bronze of the Distinguished Service Medal. She didn't wear it. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. A mail clerk came by and handed her a letter. The return address was in Beaumont. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper and a familiar crayon drawing. The letter was from Maria Garcia. Maya was doing well in her new school. Carlos had joined a baseball team. Mr. Henderson was in a wonderful nursing home just down the street from them, and they visited him every Sunday. He'd told Maria to tell Ellie that the secret to his late wife's pecan pie was, indeed, a little bit of bourbon. Ellie folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket alongside Maya's drawing. The TV droned on about policy changes and official inquiries. But for Ellie, the victory wasn't in the headlines or the reformed regulations. It was in the quiet knowledge of a little girl breathing easy, an old man at peace, and a letter that smelled faintly of crayons and hope. She finished her coffee, the weight of the medal in her pocket a familiar, comforting presence, and went back to work. There were patients to see.